It's very good to see all of you. Happy New Year and welcome to 2023. I hope it's going to be a good year for everyone. And at the Real Center, we're really looking forward to a productive year. My name is Prisha Ramsarup. I am the director of the Center for Researching Education and Labor. The Center for Researching Education and Labor, which is commonly called REAL, is based at the Wits School of Education in Parktown. And it is a center that actually looks at, it's a postgraduate research center, and it looks at studying relationships between education and the labor market. The center is involved in a wide range of skills development programs, and it is involved with multiple partners investigating skills development in various sectors in South Africa. Today, we will be engaging with speakers around our PSETA program, which we will hear more about. But we have two exciting speakers who are very involved in the public sector. So I'm sure they are going to have a lot to say about the professionalization of the public sector and what implications this is going to have for skills. And we're really looking forward to a constructive discussion today. There's a lot of different views and there's a lot that people have been conversing around professionalization of the public sector. So we're really hoping that it's going to generate a lot of interest. So colleagues, I'm going to hand you over to Shivantini Nagalingam, who is the COO of PSETA, and she can do the welcome on behalf of the CEO as she sorts a technical thing, and then we can give her an opportunity to address you later. Shivantini, over to you.
Compliments of the new year to colleagues in the room. And let me first start by welcoming our esteemed speakers, Professor Maserumule from Tshwane University of Technology and Dr. Buthelezi from Public Affairs Research Institute. Let me also welcome the Wits Research Director, Dr. Prisha Ramsarup, PSETA team members, Wits researchers, and all stakeholders that are present this morning. It gives me a great privilege to be able to join you today and welcome you to the PSETA Wits seminar on the professionalization framework for the public service, looking into implications for skills. PSETA's vision is to be the heart of developing a skilled, capable, and innovative workforce, and to be able to deliver on this vision, PSETA has adopted a strategy that is based on strategic partnerships and collaborations with key stakeholders. The partnership with Wits University Center in Researching Education and Labor is to provide research services that are related to various areas of research capacity building in the public sector. We have a 3-year partnership, and the partnership comprises of 5 streams of research into various interrelated areas that are related to the PSETA mandates, relates to areas such as e-learning in the PENT qualifications, looking into skills and demand, and lastly, the review of the competency frameworks that are in the public sector. This research work is still being finalized by Wits. We'll probably receive the report later this year. As part of the PSETA and Wits Real partnership, we are implementing a targeted research dissemination initiative, which this seminar is part of. The research dissemination initiative comprises a series of podcasts, seminars, policy briefs, and posters to encourage sharing of information, to create platforms for engagement as well as for discussion. As you are aware, ladies and gentlemen, the professionalization framework was approved by Cabinet in October 2022, and this is in pursuit of a transformed, professional, ethical, capable, and developmental public service. A seminar on the professionalization framework is delivered at an opportune time as we move towards the implementation of this framework, which will require all the relevant stakeholders in the public sector to really play their part. So the purpose of today's seminar, in short.
Okay. All right. So sorry about that. I think they are probably in the middle of load shedding in Pretoria. The signal is not great on my side. So with apologies, I'm going to keep my video off so that we can keep going. So thank you so much, Bontle. I think she's given you a short insight into the PSETA research program. Don't worry, we're not going to be spending 30 minutes explaining what the research program is, but we're very happy to communicate and with anyone that is interested in different parts of what this ongoing research program is and their various research products that will emanate. In later this year, we will be doing some work jointly. We're hoping with other colleagues that work in the public sector like Parry, we will be doing some further presentations and writing. So with that, colleagues, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague here, Kate, who is a student at REAL. She's also the seminar coordinator, and she's the person that does all of the running around to put seminars together. So Kate will introduce both the speakers, and then our first speaker will be Professor Maserumule, and then Professor Maserumule, and then the second speaker will be Professor Buthelezi. And after the speakers, we will then engage in the Q&A, which Stephanie will manage. Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prisha. Good morning, everybody. Our first speaker today is Professor Maserumule. Professor Maserumule is the Chief Editor of the Journal of Public Administration, Professor of Public Affairs, and the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the Tshwane University of Technology. He undertook various strategic assignments for the country, including coordinating the ministerial task team on the professionalization of the public service, and he is currently a member of the National Planning Commission. And our second speaker for today is Professor Buthelezi, who is an executive director at the Public Affairs Institute, Parry, and he's also an associate professor at the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies at the University of Johannesburg. He's worked in various academic and activist capacities. He's interested in the state and how the state interfaces with citizens. He served as a member of the ministerial task team on the professionalization of the public service. Over to you, Professor Maserumule.
Thank you so much, PSETA Vets, for hosting us this morning. And I just also want to acknowledge the CEO of PSETA. I just want to acknowledge as well Prisha, Dr. Pista, and also my colleagues, Professor Buthelezi. I just want to start by perhaps laying a context about what we might all be aware of insofar as the public sector is concerned. Let me just start by saying that the public sector is a very important part of the economy which the state controls. It comprises the administration of the state in all spheres of government, including those who are at the core phase of service delivery, such as your teachers, such as your nurses, including state-owned enterprises. Its distinction in a very simplistic way from the private sector is that it exists for the public good. And often when I talk about the public good, I got tempted to refer to the conceptualization of the public good by the British professor Ian McLean. He says, a public good is any good that, if supplied to anybody, is necessarily supplied to everybody, and from whose benefits it is impossible or impracticable to exclude anybody. And this is about acting in the public interest, a commitment to satisfy all aspects of human life, of which the measure of its impact is the state of happiness. Professionalizing the public sector seeks to institutionalize this disposition as a key imperative of statecraft. And this is not a newly found desirable state of the public sector. It has been part of the foundation of the country's democracy. You'll recall that in the early 90s, there was a very important promise which was made related to the professionalization of the public service. We said there shall be an efficient, non-partisan, career-orientated public service broadly representative of the South African community, functioning on a basis of fairness, and which shall serve all members of the public in an unbiased and impartial manner, and shall, in the exercise of its power and in compliance with its duty, loyally execute the lawful policies of government of the day in the performance of its administrative functions. Of course, for those of you who were there during those times, will immediately realize that this was one of the 34 principles the political party which had negotiated South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy had forged a consensus on in the early 90s, when the intention was to see the country's ties with destiny. It shaped the provisions of the 1996 Constitution, especially those which relate to the basic values and principles of public administration. And one of these is that employment and personal management practices should be based on ability, objectivity, fairness, and the need to redress the imbalances of the past to achieve representation. All of this enjoying that public service should be institutionalized as a profession. The public service should embrace the merit principle. The public service should espouse the values of probity, the value of neutrality and fairness. The Presidential Review Commission on the Transformation and Reform of the Public Service, which the former President Nelson Mandela has set up in as early as 1996 to advise him on the type of the public service required to drive the democratic system of government, emphasize the importance of the professionalization of the public service. Compared to various countries in Africa, Europe, and North America, South Africa's constitution is more emphatic on professionalizing the public service, including various pieces of legislations and policy directives. Key among these is the people-first approach to governance. Almost 2 decades later, since the inception of the democratic dispensation, a long-range plan which had mapped the country's future as the blueprint for socio-economic transformation, I'm talking about the National Development Plan, intimated emphatically the necessity to professionalize the public service as a key imperative for building state capacity and institution capability. I'm making reference to this history to make a point that the framework for the professionalization of the public sector, which the cabinet, as the CEO has already indicated, has approved in 2022, is a consummation of a long journey towards the ideal public administration, which, however, had been fraught with lapses and contradictions. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, I'm talking about the 1996 Constitution, the current Constitution, was adopted by the Constitutional Assembly on the 11th of October 1996. It was signed by Nelson Mandela on the 10th December 1996. It came into effect on the 4th February 1997. Its prescription of the values and principles governing public administration as the normative basis for the professionalization of the public service could, however, only be written into a legislation in 2014. Here I am referring to Public Administration Management Act of 2014. What am I saying? I'm saying that it took almost 2 decades for this to happen. The NDP was accepted by all parties in Parliament in 2012. Initiatives to amend the existing legislative framework to incorporate recommendations of the NDP on building state capacity and institution capability, where professionalizing the public sector was emphasized as one of the key imperatives to achieve this, only started in 2021, and they are yet to conclude. This is 10 years since the NDP's adoption. Coupled to this were the Presidential Review Committee's recommendation made in as early as 1998, where key among them was that meritocracy should be a guiding norm in staffing practices in the public service. But how can these lapses and delays be explained? Perhaps the answer is simple. South Africa does not lack great ideas, but the agency to see them through. In other words, reeling from the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic, coupled with the energy crisis, amid certain socioeconomic challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, which has found public discontent, building state capacity to institutionalize the capability required to navigate this complexity has never been more urgent. I am emphasizing this to say that we cannot afford to slack and obfuscate on the task of professionalizing the public sector any longer. And I'm glad that the CEO emphasized this, and I'm glad that your research agenda as the center emphasized this. This is because the pledge about professionalizing the public sector had long been inscripted in the foundation of South Africa's democracy. It has subsequently been reiterated in the Constitution and also repeated emphatically in the National Development Plan. The framework for the professionalization of the public sector is therefore a response to these important imperatives. Its five approach to professionalization emphasizes the following: recruitment and selection, induction and onboarding, planning and performance management, continuous learning and professional development, managing career progression and incidents. All these are interlinked, and meritocracy is the cross-cutting principle. Professionalizing the public sector is key in ensuring that the state has in its employ qualified employees with the sense of public service and the conscientiousness to perform the public function, including, more importantly, their ethical disposition, which ought to be steeped in the Mashupye principle. And this is what the framework seeks to achieve. And looking closely at the framework, it is clear that its success in terms of its implementation depends largely on the contribution of education, training, and development sector. And here I am talking particularly about the post-school education and public service sector education and training authority. And I'm glad that the CEO clearly articulated the vision of PSETA. And I am emphasizing the importance of the post-school education and the role that PSETA plays, because these are the sources of talent pipeline. The post-school education, as we all know, creates knowledge and equips students with competencies and skills, while PSETA leads the development of a skilled and competent workforce for the public service. It is in this intersection of the missions where the strategic necessity for partnership to expand the production of highly skilled professionals and enhance the innovative capacity of the nation lies. The National Development Plan had long called for this, as is key in creating economic opportunities and workforce capability, especially as the fourth industrial revolution spawns disruptive innovation and existential shock for many organizations. In other words, technology holds sway the future of work. As the 2018 Accenture study has predicted, about 6 million jobs in South Africa are likely to be lost to automation. It is predicted that by 2035, the world will have 1 trillion connected computers built into almost everything. And this is said to append humanity. And the question is, are we really ready for this? Or do we just talk so much about them? Work is what we do for the economy to exist. It is important to sustain humanity. The interplay of automation, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and communication technology has found massive implication on the existing competencies and skill set. The need to change to embrace the future of work, which is that of automation, artificial intelligence, and data-driven economy. The International Finance Corporation said 230 million jobs in sub-Saharan Africa will require digital skills by 2030. However, research suggests that as compared to the private sector, the public sector appears lacking in reimagining the workforce as heightened technology of the fourth industrial revolution lay bare their implications on the future. It is because of this that the framework on professionalization of the public sector emphasizes the importance of partnership between the post-school sector, education and training authorities, and professional associations, of course, including government itself. It regards this as a strategic imperative of the epoch where technology, which has been gathering pace for years, has now gone into overrun. And is consistent with emerging trends where traditional images of universities as self-contained autonomous institutions are being displaced by the growing numbers of them working in multiple partnerships with external organizations. I think the CEO made this point. He emphasized the importance of partnership. The framework do the same. The success of the framework in terms of its implementation, I repeat, lies on these multiple partnerships that we are actually talking about. And we are saying what we are saying because government, it is not the cause for talent pipeline problem, but experience the brand of its effect. And that is why we are emphasizing that academia, government, PSETA, LG-SETA collaboration is critically important to influence the source of talent pipeline, especially as it relates to re-educating, reskilling the workforce. Albin Toffler wrote a very interesting book titled Future Shock. And he says something very important, which I thought that is worth sharing with you. He says, the illiterate of the future would not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn and learn and relearn. And for me, this is critically important to shape our strategic disposition, especially as it relates to built-in state capacity for the public sector not to be caught napping. And the question which this partnership should assist to answer is, how can the 4IR technology be deployed to optimize the public good? And this brings to the fore the importance of reskilling. But what are those skills and competencies which are key for the future of work in the public sector? We need to be very clear about the answer to these questions to assist in shaping training and education interventions. Key, which are key in building a professional public service, key in building a strong societal leadership, key in building effective state, key in assisting to stabilize the political administrative interface. All this, the National Development Plan emphasized as the strategic imperative for building a capable and a developmental state, and the framework seeks to give effect to this. However, I need to throw a caveat here. This is because often when we talk about the future of work, we become inordinately preoccupied with the technology as if such is the binary of a human and a panacea. That shouldn't be. Lest technology become a colonizing tool that helps and furthers accumulation of capital at the expense of human lives. As we talk about the 4IR as an important marker of the modern society from the future of work perspective, we should at the same time make sure that technology does not displace humanity in the architecture of statecraft, but complement human ingenuity within the state to drive a developmental agenda and make human life good life. And for me, this is critically important context to shape our imagination of the future of work in the public sector, including answering a critically important question about the first industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, and the third industrial revolution in terms of how they contributed to the efficiency of the state. And if they did, what was the reason for this? And what is that which we should do differently to maximum the benefits of technology towards building state capacity and institutional capability? Like as I said, the future of work in the public sector does not only lie in developing digital skills, but cognitive skills and character formation for the ethical disposition of public administration. Related to this is the sequencing of academic curricula for students of government studies. In our curricula, we need to think about modules and pedagogical approaches which train students to be thinkers, not just specialists. This is important to hone their analytical skills. Again, there is the epistemic question of the discipline, where in various instances, our teachings remain stuck in the shibboleths of the new public management, where students are taught business principles to run government. This logic needs to change. We need to frame our programs in a way which seeks to institutionalize a humanitarian public service, where the following virtues ought to underscore the philosophical orientation of our curricular package: compassion, caring, humanness, sharing, respect, so forth and so on. In other words, an important instruction to students of public affairs ought to be that to use Den Haag and Den Haag's words. Government should not be run like a business. It should be run like a democracy. And from this instruction, you could clearly see the implication of where we want to go through this professionalization framework and And as universities, as PSETA, or any other cities, we need to start to strategically make sure that we position ourselves so that we can always be ready for the future that we have imagined. Let me end here, and thank you so much for your audience.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for kickstarting the discussion this morning. I think you've set a very solid basis for the discussion today, and your insights and experience of both the framework as well as insights around the public sector, which I think is going to be useful. We heard very clearly the messages of collaboration and the role of PSETA as well as the PSET sector and DHET in the reskilling and upskilling of stakeholders or employees within the public sector, and the importance of concentrating on building the public sector workforce. And I think that I know that you probably have multiple comments and multiple questions after that very powerful presentation from Professor Maserumule. But I'm going to ask you to please use the Q&A as well as the chat and add your questions, and Professor Alays will pick them up after our next speaker today. So colleagues, he has already been introduced, but I'd really like to call our next speaker, Professor Buthelezi from PARI. And we are really glad to be able to work with PARI and Mbongiseni, as well as his colleagues from PARI, have been very useful to us as we've worked with us within the PSETA program. And we know that a lot of the research that's happening at PARI looks at the effectiveness of state institutions. They have been also doing research around skills and the delivery of services and infrastructure within the public sector. So we're really glad that Professor Buthelezi could take some time to be with us this morning. So welcome again, and thank you so much for making time. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prisha, and greetings to all our participants, and greetings to the CEO of PSETA and to colleagues at REAL. Maybe I think in the framing of the discussion today, Professor Maserumule, and good morning, Professor Maserumule, has made it clear, I think, that it's not just, there's a framing in the description of the event that asks the question of what skills would be required to professionalize the public service. And then the secondary question is really skills the issue. So I think Professor Maserumule has made it abundantly clear that it's not just skills. Skills are important and critical, but it's not just skills that are required. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack to try and come at the second question and sort of bring it to ground level somewhat. And here I want to also start by saying, I speak as somebody who has never worked in the public sector in any way, except as an academic who's been employed at different universities over time. And so I also speak as a user of a lot of public services. And so some of the examples I will use are from that experience as a user of public services, interfacing with departments like Home Affairs, driving on public roads, and like all of us do, and the rest. So I think let me then begin by saying the context in which we are talking about this is a context that I think is quite stark for all of us. Professor Maserumule touched on it in passing, but we're in a state where we're talking about professionalizing the public service and talking about it quite late in some ways, or beginning to do this work quite late, as Professor Maserumule said, in a context where our economy is completely dire, with absolutely scary unemployment figures. So as of last year, of course, you know that South Africa was deemed the most unequal country in the world, in which the official unemployment figure set at 33%, and the unemployment figure, according to the latest stats from Stats SA, for people aged 15 to 24 was 63.9%. We are also in a context where we've got to think about professionalization, where public infrastructure is crumbling. Think about the load shedding. I mean, I'm actually currently sitting in load shedding, as many of us are. Think about those of us who traveled through the holidays. The state of the roads in many places, the state of the water infrastructure. Key basic things that we need to be able to run an economy, to operate, to go to work, in a dire state where they're crumbling. And the festive season, I think for many of us, makes this also abundantly clear, because we travel, we get to see other parts of the country. I spent 2 weeks that took me on a road trip that took me through 7 of the 9 provinces of the country over December, and I'm absolutely horrified by the state of public infrastructure. But I think more than that, we are in a situation where I think we're seeing collapsing authority of the state. And we see this in the way in which, in many instances, people just do whatever they want because they think they can get away with it. But I think the bottom line also that we need to accept is that as much as I paint this dire picture, the reality is there's a great deal of unevenness. There are also pockets of excellence, and I think we need to hold that in mind and accept that there are those pockets of excellence in the state that we can still look to. So the next point I want to make is also in this context that I've painted. We've also heard since it became President Ramaphosa constantly decrying the incapability of the public service. Similarly, we hear endless complaints from business, from civil society, complaining about state-owned companies, including Transnet, including complaining about the state of our roads, etc. And so I think there's a general acceptance that something needs to be done and needs to be done urgently. But in the same context, we've also seen the president's attempt to deal with this incapability of the public service that he talks about so often, being one, starting to govern through councils, committees, advisory bodies, which are not institutionalized into the state. And that's something that we need to watch carefully, and I think we need to be worried about. But there are also broader contextual problems that are causing this incapability of the state. And some of them are enumerated quite eloquently, I think, in the document, but I'll talk a little bit later about what the document was in part trying to achieve and its limitations. And so some of these are not articulated as forcefully as perhaps in earlier drafts and in deliberations of the task team were able to talk about these things. So one of those things, let's be frank, political leadership, and especially the kind of factionalism into which the ruling alliance has descended over time. There's partly as a result of that, and for other reasons, recruitment into the public service has tended to prioritize political criteria over professional criteria. The politicization of the public service that we talk about. We also, PARI does a lot of work in municipalities. We worked for many years with Salga, as Prisha alluded to, and Kate as well, going into municipalities, trying to understand at ground level how things work, what doesn't work, what works. And one of the things, of course, that we see that, again, the framework talks quite a lot about is extremely poor planning, performance planning in municipalities is in a very, very sorry state. But also performance management, not just in municipalities, but in fact, across the public service in many instances, is in a very sorry state. which then means it opens the door to corruption, among other things. People can do things and they'll get away with it because they will not be held accountable by anybody. But also, the next point I want to make is that, the final version of this document that was published talks about this at page 27, is a design problem in our system of governance. I mean, on page 47, it talks about the Constitution concentrating a lot of power in councils, which then is a recipe for the kind of politicization that we've seen. And I think linked to that is also that we're also then dealing with a system that has never achieved coherence since those aspirations that Professor Maserumule talked about were articulated. And then finally, at ground level, I think one of the problems we also need to talk about, and this is not an exhaustive list of problems, one of the just very basic issues that you and I deal with going to a department to get service is that when you have a problem with the service you're getting, with the attitude you're getting from a public servant, there is absolutely no recourse mechanism in many instances, where the recourse mechanism is just a phone number and it says, call this number, and usually the phone goes unanswered. And I'll give you an example of what my own family has experienced. In 2020, my extended family had been here from the United States, and they had come and they wanted to stay on for a few days after the expiry of their visas. And they were sent from pillar to post, going to Home Affairs offices, being given completely conflicting information about how you extend your stay. Eventually, when they were leaving the country, they got banned from South Africa at the airport. And they were told, you need to appeal, send an appeal to this email address. And almost 3 years later, at the end of November last year, they had received no response after several follow-ups to that email address. What it took was finding a person through personal networks who works in the appeals section of the Department of Home Affairs, who could then expedite an appeal that was lodged almost 3 years before. And so there was no recourse mechanism except to go the route of personalizing, getting what should be a public service that's available publicly to anybody who needs it. So with all of that, what we've seen, and we see this again in this framework, it articulates a number of statements, of plans, of policies, of legislation, of aspirations that have previously been made, been released publicly, including the National Development Plan that Professor Maserumule referred to, and many others, the Constitution, etc., right down to this professionalization framework itself. But what we've seen, of course, is that often many of these documents that have had massive energy poured into producing them become just another document, yet another document that ends up sitting and gathering dust on shelves, as the old expression used to go. But of course, in the context in which we work, that Professor Maserumule was referring to, talking about the skills revolution that's needed for the 21st century and beyond, it also becomes unreadable sitting on hard drives and on clouds somewhere in the third and the fourth industrial revolutions. All of this, I think, creates what I think we can agree is a credibility crisis for the state, a credibility crisis for the political leadership of the country, for the ruling alliance. And that credibility crisis has really brought us to what I think we should also agree is a low point where we are at this point. All these plans have been made, all these aspirations have been articulated, but many of us, I think, sit with the sense that things just keep getting worse. We always often think it can't get any worse than this, and then it goes and does. Think of the ESCOM example. When we were sitting in stage 2 load shedding, we thought, can't get any worse than this, and we got to stage 6, and we keep getting told we're a step away from stage 8. So let me then get to what is to be done to make this professionalization framework not just another document. I think there are perhaps different categories of things that we need to think about. Again, going beyond skills. There are things that are within the control of professionals, that are within the state, of leaders that are within the state already. There are things that professional bodies can do, as one of the questions that came in the chat is asking. There are things that require the much vaunted political will, and I'm no longer sure that concept, what that concept means, and whether it serves us well in even our own discussions. And then beyond that, I think there are things that require public pressure and what I want to call an activist population, rather than what has often been called active citizens. So before I get to some of those things, I want to say just briefly about the framework itself and the context in which it was produced and what it was trying to achieve. So I think the two things I want to say there. One is the framework is trying to be realistic within the existing system. So what it is trying to propose is things that are achievable in the political and the professional environment in which it is trying to intervene, in which we find ourselves. And so what has happened is, and I can't really say much more about this, is that, as I mentioned in passing earlier, there's been some modification, what one might call some watering down, of some of the more hard-hitting diagnosis and some of the more hard-hitting recommendations that had come up in previous iterations and drafts of this document. And that is partly because what we didn't want to produce was a document that is so out of touch with the political and the professional contexts in which we work, that articulates aspirations that are perhaps might be the right aspirations, the right recommendations, but simply cannot be achievable, and it becomes something that would have met resistance almost from the start, from anywhere from the ruling alliance or anywhere from some of the departments that are tasked with implementing the recommendations of this framework. And the second thing is also that the document, and it becomes, for some people who've read it and who've given feedback, long-winded on some of these things, but it needed to articulate with existing legislation, with existing frameworks, policy, principles, as well as aspirations, including the Constitution, the Public Service Act, including Mashupye, etc. There has been some criticism that says the framework outlines a monumental task that includes legislative reform, includes organizational restructure within the state, includes inculcating new values, new cultures of service, reforming training systems, competency frameworks, and assessments, and a whole lot more. And so it's been criticized for being too ambitious and not realistic enough about outlining what can be achieved in the immediate term, what can be achieved in the long run, and what can be achieved in the medium term. But of course, I also want to quickly point out here that some of the low-hanging fruit have already, some announcements have been made around this. So the question of the tenure of DGs, for example, is something that a pronouncement has been made on. But let me then come, as I move towards concluding, to some key things that I think we need to bear in mind, keep a focus on, and think about how to achieve as we think about the road ahead. And I want to just also be brief on some of those things and not name too many of them. And again, this is not an exhaustive list of things that need to be borne in mind and need to be achieved. So I think the first thing that we need to accept is that the road ahead is a long one, and it's not a linear process. What do I mean by this? Public service reform in any country that has done it and done it successfully has been a very lengthy process. It's a lengthy process, and I think the time horizons we really need to be working with is at least 20 to 30 years. Of course, the NDP's vision is to 2030, but for this purpose, for this project of public service reform, of professionalizing the public service, we need to be thinking way beyond that. The challenge that faces us in that regard is the question of how do we find ways to ensure that this project is not just a flavor of the season, but that coherent work continues across administrations over this long durée that we need to be thinking about when we think about public service reform and when we think about professionalizing the public service. And that, I think, is a big political question. There's some headwinds that we face in that regard, and I'll touch on one of them at the end. The second thing that we need to be thinking about, and again, it's articulated in the document, is this question of how do we begin? I want to say how do we begin anew, but that's probably not the right articulation. How do we begin from where we are? When we have people in the public service, for example, in municipalities, for example, who've been there in their jobs for 40 years. We've found this in a lot of municipalities where we've worked, where somebody says when there's an attempt to introduce a new process, for example, and they say, I've been doing this thing for 30 years, and no child who comes in here, who's been in here for 2 years, who comes from university, can tell me that I need to change how I work. And here again, one of the things we run into is the role played by trade unions in that kind of resistance to changing processes, to changing systems in state institutions. So how do we begin from where we are, where we work with what we've got to begin to move towards achieving the aspirations of this framework? And my suggestion is that we really need to think about coming at this from two directions. And one of those we've had some articulation of, as I've said, implementing some major changes that are proposed in the senior management service on one hand. So coming at it from that direction, professionalizing in that direction, competence, including the training, the induction that happens at that level, and that the framework says needs to be reviewed and set some timelines for when that review, including the Uganda program, sets some timelines for when it needs to be reviewed. But at the same time, and this was almost a running joke in the task team, the question that somebody put it in a way that, of course, doesn't land well when you use an expression like you need to teach. It's difficult to teach an old dog new tricks. So somebody made the joke at one point that what we need to do is also just forget about the people who are already in the public service and look at new cohorts and how they get brought in as the framework envisages, and how they become cohorts that will move through the public service, move up their ranks at the same time, and hold each other professionally accountable. Right. So I think, and then there's of course a middle, that if you work, I think this from those two ends, you can then deal with the problems that you have where people join the public service, they get inducted a year, 2 years after they join the public service, you can get to that. So I think key starting point for me is to work from the top and work from the bottom and get to the middle as you go along. The third thing I want to talk about, which I've touched on earlier as well, is that there are pockets of excellence that need to be replicated and propagated, that can be held up as examples of how you can do this and do it well. In the work of the task team, I think an example that came up was the Auditor General of South Africa and how they went about the process of professionalizing. Another example that's been talked about publicly quite a lot in the past, and the institution is now trying to recover, of course, from what happened to it at the height of state capture, what has been called state capture, is SARS. So those institutions and practices that exist where there are pockets of excellence, I think we need to do a better job of holding those, of making an example of those, of making them publicly visible, and making people who work in those institutions publicly visible as models of excellence and how professionalization can be achieved in the public sector more broadly. The fourth thing is, of course, it links to the previous point about how we begin from where we are. It's critical that we need to think about how you bring along people that are already there in the system and you don't leave them behind. We start, as often public discourse does, saying to people who work in the public sector how useless they are, how nothing can ever be achieved because we've employed a bunch of useless public servants. That is not a helpful approach. And so we need to find ways of working with existing people and nudging them in the directions in which we want this whole system to go. So make sure that we don't make people feel useless, make sure that we don't make people feel discouraged, where morale sinks even lower than some of where it is in some parts of the state. And then the last thing, and I talk as somebody again who sits sometimes in an activist role, but in an organization that does advocacy work. I want to say what we also need to be thinking about is how to work with people outside of the state. We talked about professional bodies somewhat, and we can come back in discussion to the question asked in the chat about the role of professional bodies. But I think we also need to think about roles for a constituency, a public constituency, that can do things like putting pressure on leaders of the public service, but also on political leaders for things that are in this framework to be implemented and for this framework to keep moving us forward. And here I think civil society organizations need to play a much bigger role. But what we also then need to think about when we think about civil society is not the attitude that we've often seen, which is civil society being thought of as the enemy of the state, as the enemy of the public service, but actually how to articulate. And civil society, I think, can play a role in helping, in fact, sometimes amplify the voices of people who cannot say things from their own professional positioning within the state, say things that they need said, but also hold their feet to the fire, hold the feet of politicians to the fire. And I think in that instant, in that regard, the framework as it stands, I think can serve us really well as an advocacy tool that we in civil society can then use to advocate for these kinds of reforms. The framework, I think, is a starting point, and it's not the be all and the end all. It's not the last word in the discussion that needs to be had. And as you see, it makes recommendations, and some of those recommendations still need to be taken forward by departments. And it names the DPSA, the Public Service Commission, DPME, etc., as places where some of these recommendations need to be concretized and taken forward. And then to end off, what I want to finally point out is then returning to the document itself. I think what it articulates really helpfully at the end, pages 96 to 98, is how this is going to be taken forward. So I think the first thing is giving clear marching orders from top leadership, political leadership in the country. It is very clear that the national framework will become part of it will be coordinated, monitored, and become part of implementation plans in departments. This, together with the president's foreword, I think gives a very serious indication that there's some level of seriousness in the political leadership. The question becomes how to maintain this high-level political support and how to keep this running, as I said, across administrations as political leadership changes, as DGs change, for example, as people in the senior management service change. So that's the challenge for us. And this, again, is where civil society, articulating, working with people within the state, professionals in the state, can make the right noises to try and make sure that this doesn't fall off the radar. It is maintained over time. And I think the usefulness of those last 3 pages is that they signal that and they articulate where different parts of driving this process need to be held, need to be monitored, where implementation needs to happen. And I find that a very useful part of the document. So I suggested earlier that, of course, there are some headwinds, and I'm just going to mention the one glaring and obvious one, which is that we are facing the 2024 national and provincial elections, and the political leadership, the political commitment to some of this is something that is going to face serious challenge in what is being anticipated if there is a change in political leadership in the country. And we see at national and in some provinces the kinds of unstable coalitions that we've seen in some cities like Johannesburg, where we are based, like in Tshwane, like in Nelson Mandela Bay. And so the question of whether this work here becomes sustainable or how it gets sustained is one that we need, I think, to seize ourselves with. We need to take the opportunity that we've got between now and that prospect of coalition governments coming into power to actually get a lot of this work as far down the road as we can, so that some of it, I mean, it cannot be reversed. So I think that's really the biggest challenge that faces this and a whole lot of other work that is ongoing to professionalize the public service. So I will then stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mbongiseni. I think you've really raised a lot of important issues, and I think the questions coming in really show that it does. You both of the presentations have really hit on issues that are very important to South Africans in general. And yeah, and the participation in the seminar, this webinar is also testimony to that. We've got nearly 100 participants. Colleagues, I've got a number of questions in the Q&A and in the chat, and I'm going to move over to them now. Just one of them from Karen Kotsky was if the framework is available, and we have put a link to it in the chat. So if anyone wants to go and read the framework, it is there in the chat. I just have to say, Mbongiseni, that when you started talking about page 98, I got quite frightened. It sounds like it's a very long document. So colleagues, if you would like to ask your question, we really do encourage colleagues to raise their hands, and then we can promote you to a panelist, and we can see your face and hear your voice, and you can ask your own question. So please do raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. If not, I can read the question out. I have one hand up at the moment, and I can't see who it is because it just tells me that it's Samsung. It's a Samsung phone, I guess, whoever's on that. And then I have Sylvia Hammond with her hand up. So I think that both of those have been enabled to talk. No, I'll do that now. And then, I don't know, we've got a question from Bongani Mbewu, we've got a question from Yael Shalem, a question from Karen Kotsky, which I also was going to ask a similar question. And then we've got Andrew Reineke and Lanley Simpson. If any of you would like to ask your question, and Temba Chabalala, if any of you would like to ask your question, please do raise your hand. Otherwise, I will read the questions out. But I'm going to hand over first to the two people who want to raise their questions live. So let's start with you, Sylvia. And then maybe we can move to Samsung if they can tell us who they are.
Thank you, Steph. I can't work out how to put my video on, but I'm happy. Thank you for two really excellent presentations. I thoroughly enjoyed listening, and I'm totally on board with what is being said. From my perspective, everything I hear indicates to me that what we have is a requirement for good generalist human resource management skills. And that fits in with some of the comments in the chat from Andy Reindker, for example. This is a requirement for liaising and engaging with the professional bodies. The skills exist to do what is required, whether it is dealing with people who died in the war, been there for 40 years, whether it's inducting new young people, whether it's engaging people to motivate, to manage performance and so on. These are all human resource management skills, and they are available nationally. We just need to bring them all on board in a structured way. That's my comment rather than a question.
Thanks, Sylvia. I don't know if Samsung SMA13 wants to talk and tell us your name. If not, I'll hand over to Yael Shalem, but maybe I'll take a few questions and then I'll hand back to the speakers. But maybe just to read out Andrew Reineker's question, because I think it relates to Sylvia's, or to Sylvia's comment. Professional bodies should be central in supporting this professionalization framework. As a member of two professional bodies, my impression is that they're not being engaged to any meaningful extent. So that's also a comment, and I think both of them relate to professional bodies. And I think that Yael's typed a question in the Q&A, and it also has some kind of relationship to that issue. So I'm going to hand over to her now to ask her question. And then after that, I'll hand back to the panelists, and then we've got a bunch of questions that all relate to politicization. So maybe we'll take those as a collective next. Over to you, Yael.
Thank you for the presentations this morning. I really found them very insightful, and I love the passion behind the presenters. I also read the professionalization report, and I think it's fantastic. So my question is, within the framework of professionalization, I have a quibble, not so much with the framework, but with how we apply it to the position of managers in the public sector. Because management in the public sector is defined as a transversal occupation, which in simple English means that managers can take the knowledge of management from one public department and apply it to management of another public department. So, and that suggests that the core knowledge of managers would be public administration and management, which we know lots of people like to do those kind of qualifications in public management. And there are short courses about management, there are master's courses about management, but what is undermined by it is the core knowledge of the occupational field that a particular department is servicing. So if a department is servicing the sector of education, the core knowledge is education. And if a department is servicing finance, the core knowledge is around finance. The same for any other department. There's always core knowledge underneath management of public administration. So in my view, professionalization would be that we're taking professionals in those fields and we top it up with knowledge of management. But I don't think the appointment of managers are going like that. And we have managers managing department that don't know the field that they're managing. They learn it as they go. So I feel that, in short, my question is, what do you think the best way of professionalizing managers?
Okay, before we inundate the speakers with too many questions, Let's pause for now on the questions and comments and get responses from either of the two speakers.
I cannot agree with you more, because that is basically the issue that we also talked about as the ministerial panel. The idea is to look at the multiple levels at which a manager could actually be professionalized. In other words, a manager gets professionalized at the generic management level, and also the manager ought to be professionalized at the level of a particular specific occupation that relates to his or her department. So we look at it at multiple levels, because you see, when you look at the whole notion of professionalization, as we conceptualize it, we did not really look at it as being about dichotomies of capabilities. We look at professionalization as a means to forge confluence of capabilities, right? So that we thought that is critically important, because we did not really want to go along with how the notion of professionalization has always been understood as being about a particular limited to a particular occupation. Yes, people need to be grounded in their occupation. In other words, they ought to be at the cutting edge of what is required insofar as their professional occupation is concerned. But also remember, in addition to that, there are other critically important broader issues, particularly if that particular person is operating within the context of the state. And therefore, our approach to professionalization is at multiple levels, not just only limited to an occupational field insofar as a particular profession is concerned. And the question of professional bodies, and I'm glad that you are raising that, because we need to get to those professional bodies. As we're putting together the framework, we try to include or rather get or interact with as many professional bodies as possible, to the extent that even in the panel, we had quite a number of colleagues that represented professional bodies. Obviously, it couldn't be all of them because there are many of them in the country. But as part of the implementation, we should actually interact with all the professional bodies, because we do also have a list of those professional bodies from SAQA, because some of them are registered with SAQA. And also, more importantly, like as I pointed out earlier on, the success in terms of the implementation of the framework also depends on partnerships with the very same professional bodies with the universities, for example. So part of the implementation of the framework will involve interacting with the universities and try to chart some kind of an understanding in terms of a particular role that they ought to play as it relates to the professionalization of the public service. And then from there also, I think there is another issue as it relates to, I think it's the issue that was raised by Bongani. In case where the CEOs are being forced, the chief financial officers are being forced by politicians to do the right things. Bongani, that's a very important question, because we spend so much time also as the ministerial task team debating the whole question of politicization of the bureaucracy, or even, and it's even worse in the municipality. However, as we're talking about that, another interesting dynamic emerged, that it is not only party politics that influence how things ought to be done within our, within the administrations of the state. There was a very interesting case of about 4 or 3 submissions that were made from certain municipalities, where they decried the fact that HR is actually captured by the unions, right? So it is not only a party politics, it is also union politics, you know. So what we said was that we have to be very clear that to politicize the administration of the state to that extent, in other words, you politicize the administration of the state for self-saving ends, it ought to be made illegal. In fact, there is law. If you check your public service regulations and many other pieces of legislation, if you read them carefully, that thing is declared as illegal and therefore it ought to be treated as such. However, the long-term solution to the problem, because there are many instances where some of our officials do not really seem to have a strong ethical character, right? And the other thing which came quite strong in our discussions about that was that, can we take a long-term view in terms of how we can solve these things? In other words, let's go back to how we actually educate and train these people. And one of the critical components of that education and training ought to focus on what we call character formation. In other words, our education system should not just only be about developing the cognitive faculties of these people that we want to prepare them to work in the state. We must also focus on, shaping, their ethical character so that when they graduate, we have a complete person who is cognitively sound, who is ethically sound. So if you do have those type of people in the system, it is going to be very difficult for party politics to influence these people to do the wrong things. About some of the criticisms that came in terms of saying that the framework is actually too ambitious, I will argue that it's not, because largely most of the things that people are saying that the framework is ambitious on, those are the things that have already started to happen. Like as we speak now, the public service legislative reform to cohere with some of the recommendation of the framework is already underway. Some of them are part of the parliamentary processes. Some of them have already been approved through the cabinet processes. So in that regard, I think we are actually making significant headway. Professor Buthelezi has already talked about the tenure of the DG. The decision has already been taken about that. And also the question of making the DG in the office of the president as the head of public administration. The intention being to manage, the political administrative interface. It has already happened. So there are significant progress made in relation to various recommendations of the framework. The other important issue, our approach as we're dealing with the whole question of professionalization, we said to ourselves that we should not just only, professionalization should not just only focus on an individual, but it must also focus on systems and processes that makes an institution. Hence, we even coin a concept, institutional professionalization. So it is not just only about an individual. It is about the entirety of the system. So these are some of the things which I could remember from the chat box, and maybe if there is something that I left, I could maybe Professor Buthelezi will actually answer them. But yeah, the last one, Karen, you asked a very important question that we seem to have had a clear idea of what we want, right? But we are not yet there. I think it's a fundamentally important question. And that has always been my concern. That has always been my contention that as a country, we had brilliant ideas, right? The issue is lack of sense of agency in terms of translating those ideas into practice. And I think also as part of this future strategy that you are referring to, Karen, I think also going back to how we educate, how we train future public servants. We need to find a way in which we could make them to understand and appreciate the significance of sense of agency in terms of implementation of certain programs and policy decision. So I fully agree with you, Karen. Temba, separation from party rhetoric, professionalization is a very important question as well. That is why, Temba, we want the universities to also, right, take certain parts of the framework which they can drive from their institution. And also remember, professionalization is about producing an ideal public servant who could actually be at the cutting edge of his or her craft. And that largely is the responsibility of learning institutions. You know, so professionalization should not really be, it should not really become a political rhetoric. It should be a conscious, right, process of trying to create an ideal public servant that we want, knowing very well that when we unleash this person in the public service, he or she will do what he or she is supposed to do for the public good. You know, so it shouldn't really, politics should not really come close to political rhetoric, should not actually come close to professionalization. Let me leave it here and hand over to Prof. Maybe he could pick up to some of the questions that I might have actually missed. Thanks.
Thanks, Prof. Maybe let me, I think Professor Maserumule has covered a lot of what I was going to talk about, but I want to just add maybe some detail on some of those things and my own take on others. So, I mean, let me start also with the IL's input. I think you talked about the way in which at senior level there's talk about transversal management skills, but I think, and Professor Maserumule has addressed that, but I think it extends further than that. And there's, to me, I'm beginning to think there's something we need to do to rethink some of the training that happens at universities in particular. So if we think about, yes, the need for say, in water affairs, people who have water engineering skills, people who have contract management skills, if we continue along with the outsourcing model that we work with in the state, etc. Those are people who have developed particular sets of skills that are, I think, of relevance, as you've said, DIL, that when they move up through the ranks, you want to retain those skills in the appropriate department and not have people move up into management where suddenly they jump from one department and they can just go and be managers in arts and culture when really they've honed their skills in water management. It's where, to me, and this is only one part of the issue, and it also then begins to be challenging. I've been tracking, for example, just a little bit, people who have studied public administration and what their careers once they go into the public service look like. Somebody who worked in the presidency, who's now outside of government, said to me, people who come in with undergrad qualifications in public administration, most of them end up as senior secretaries and they hit a ceiling. They don't have the core skills that the IL you were talking about. And so that brings up the question for me of, so what are the skills we should be training people for? I mean, is public administration relevant as something that we train people for in universities? Or do we need to do some rethinking of what we train at undergrad level? It's a question that has kind of cropped up over the last few weeks, actually, for me, and I don't have an answer to it. But I think, yeah, the point is what you were saying about senior management, I think extends to other levels in the public service, and there's some rethinking that we need to do. And again, I think it links to this question. that is being asked about the role of PSETA, for example. I think, again, I'm not sure what the question is, the right question is in terms of the work that PSETA does at this point. But I think some thinking about some of those sort of basic skills that people then enter the public service with is required in my view. The point about professional bodies, I think I want to add to what Professor Maserumule said. That one of the things we were also thinking about in the task team was the role that those professional bodies can play in recruitment, for example, in managing career incidents, in managing career progression of people in the public service. And they are, we agree entirely, I agree that they are not used adequately. In fact, in some instances, hardly used at all. So let's take, for example, the HR function that's been talked about. Now, there are certain categories of public servants, nurses, teachers who are required to be members of professional bodies. And those professional bodies can hold them accountable for ethical lapses. They can, people cannot practice if they do not maintain a current registration with the professional body. But look at what happens when people come into the public service. There are HR practitioners in the public service who are not members of the professional HR bodies. And so when they do nefarious things, and again, the point that has been made, what we found in a lot of places, in municipalities, for example, it's not just unions, as Professor Maserumule said, that capture the HR function. We've seen this in education. It's also that there's a lot of coordination that happens between business people on one hand, public servants, as well as politicians, to capture the HR function so that they then can appoint people into finance, into supply chain management, that they can then dictate to what to do. So the payments that are made before invoices have even reached the municipality, because this network has built itself around HR, captured HR, and then appointed people who are either part of the network or people that they can control, whose own career or whose own jobs rather are dependent on these networks. It's something we've seen time and time again in municipalities. The HR professionals have nowhere to turn to because they're not part of a professional body. So I think at that level, we do need to make better use of professional bodies, but also, as I said earlier, on recruitment panels. We're suggesting in some of our discussions that those professional bodies should, it's something that could be made part of their own public responsibility, civic responsibility, that on a pro bono basis, they are able to help working with the Public Service Commission, for example, when they are putting together selection panels, put somebody on that selection panel on a pro bono basis. So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that direction. And then lastly, the question asked by Sylvia on HR skills, HR management. Again, we've seen that in our research, we find that in a lot of places, for example, there is no, they're meant to be basic HR skills, where people, for example, when people are appointed, right, they get put through induction processes, they get put through, also managers, by the way, with good HR skills, right, who do proper performance contracting, proper performance management. And in many places, that simply does not exist. Not just in municipalities, in fact, it's across the public service. And so, yes, indeed, there's work that needs to be done just to get that system working. So it's really sort of ground level work, very basic things, that if we can get those right, we can then begin to see things begin to move. And I think this articulates with the point I was making earlier about recourse mechanisms, where if there's proper HR management in the public service, we can then have actually recourse mechanisms for the public that actually begin to work as well. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks, Mbongiseni. So I think that both of the speakers have actually tried to answer the questions that are in the chat and the Q&A, as well as the ones that were asked out. but I just really want to foreground Karen's question. You know, I think, and Mbongiseni, you did mention, you alluded to the phenomena of kind of governance via committee and so on. But I think, you know, I think we're also very all acutely aware of government via policies. And, you know, why has this never happened before? And is this, the fact that we've got a document, this framework now going to make it, going to solve it? Or have there been other, you know, has there been a kind of a real analysis of why we've really failed to professionalize the public service so far? You know, Bongani's question maybe points to that. So Bongani is saying in the Q&A, my view is that the public sector environment, inclusive of local government, does allow for appointment and retention of qualified and skilled personnel, but that there's a kind of tendency to force CFOs to pay service providers. Yeah, so what are the real kind of what have been the stumbling blocks? What's the analysis of why we have failed for such a long time, and what's going to make it different this time around? And then I'm going to hand over to Francine to ask a question.
Thank you for this interesting seminar and the contribution of the two speakers. I mean, for me, I suppose, and you did mention it earlier, Stephanie, is that there are a lot of questions about the cadre redeployment and the political appointees. And, you know, the idea of the document is to push a merit-based appointment, but I don't see this happening. And in our research, we ask a lot of people from the PSETAs if they thought that a political redeployment will change in any ways, especially at the top level. And very few people believe that it did. So I just want to ask the panelists what they think could be done and how it should be done to avoid this cadre redeployment policy to continue. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think Temba's questions, Temba is on the panel now. Temba, I think your questions are very linked. So do you want to just come in and unmute yourself and ask them, and maybe switch your camera on also? Thank you.
Okay. No, I think Professor Maserumule has already answered my question, because I just wanted to ask, yes, we've developed the professionalization framework, but to what extent can its recommendations and possibly its implementation be separated from politics? So it was basically, how would professionalizing the public service straddle between the politics and administration nexus? So that was just my question. But I think the Prof has already spoken at length at how that could be addressed.
Yeah, I think addressing it is never gonna be simple. I think, you know, we've had some ideas, but I think we need a lot more on how to address it. And Annette Lopes's comment and question in the Q&A also talks about a different aspect of politicization, which is political factionalism, where the minister sets up programs and projects which disrupt and undermine the core strategic work at hand by the department and its officials. I'm going to give one more person to ask a question, which is Nkosipi Nyandu, who, if you could switch your camera on and come in.
Okay, thanks, Chairperson of the session. Actually, it's not a question, it's a comment. Thanks very much for this session. And I'm a bit worried that the DG for public service is not the guest while you are discussing something that is very important. My comment, Chairperson, is that the issue is not about the skills. As it was not the skills yesterday, it is not about the skills today. It is not. It will not be about the skills tomorrow. The issue, Chairperson, is the heart of the senior management, morals and ethics. Those are issues that even you can You can have a 6 million professor, the first speaker, talk about 6 million employees getting skills in digital skills. But those people, as long as their heart are not a caring heart, caring for society, we will achieve nothing. Lastly, Chairperson, the example, the Department of Education launched a project called the Dinaledi Schools, where each schools got 50% of teachers in that school were mathematics educators. But almost all those schools collapsed because of recruitment based on unionism, not on competent. All those schools collapsed. What happened after that project, which was very beautiful? We have a mathematics literacy. So I'm saying we can produce any skill, even a space skill, as long as the change of heart, especially in the senior management, in the public service, the country will go nowhere. Thanks, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mbongiseni. And I think there's a comment in the chat and a question from Skalkberger, who talks about humanity and consciousness and disseminating, trying to raise citizens' awareness of how they should be treated by the public service. Sarah, yes, let's hear from you. And please, can we see your face also?
Sorry, Stephanie, I'm not going to show my face simply because I'm sitting in a squashed corner of the lounge next to my son trying to access the best Wi-Fi. So it's just a response to some of the questions on the extent to which the framework really provides a kind of robust platform for depoliticizing the public administration, which has emerged as a kind of key part of the discussion today, and which also shapes the context in which those more interested in the training side have the space to do their work, or whether that remains difficult, in the face of politicization. So, I mean, I think that the document that the panel for the framework on the professionalization of the public service, including the two speakers, Mbongiseni, my boss, and Professor Maserumule, developed, was a really robust document. It then went through the kind of machinery of government and has come out as a very thorough document, but also one with some ambiguity around how precisely the state is going to deal with this question of depoliticization, precisely how we're going to appoint DGs going forward, precisely how we're going to select the new sort of head of the public administration, and that new head of the public administration, which at the moment looks like it's going to be the DG of the presidency, how precisely those processes are embedded in legislation and managed will matter for whether we actually end up with processes that lead to more kind of meritocratic and depoliticized appointments or not. So in other words, within that framework, there's a lot of room for researchers and civil society interested in this space to be keeping track and providing advice on how we think that those nuts and bolts actually get developed, because we could have something that makes it look as if the government has addressed this problem, but in practice, the precise details of the legislation in practice doesn't, in fact, and we're left with much the same situation. So there's a very important and I think quite maybe optimistic kind of window of opportunity. And I think that, like sort of how 10 years delinked, for example, will become crucial to a question that somebody else in the Q&A asked about the fact that ministers can often come in with a pet project, which then undermines the work, the kind of sort of strategic work of the department or ongoing programs, and undermines that kind of work. Some of the proposals made in that framework address that directly, but how precisely they get embedded will be something we'll need to watch quite carefully. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that. I think that was really helpful. And I mean, I guess, it relates, that's the classic South African quandary, is implementation. We tend to be very good at developing policies and not as good at implementing them. So we've just got 10 minutes left, and I'm going to hand back to the speakers to address those issues and any other last issues that they feel are crucial.
Thanks, Prof. Let me just quickly deal with some of the questions that I managed to get. Prof will actually assist in terms of where I omitted some. I think the consistent theme which is emerging from the colleagues in the platform largely is centered around the challenge of politics in the administration. And also your question, Prof, of saying that, but why did we fail so long? Why did it take us so long? Like as I indicated in the paper, we started to be very clear as a country in the early 90s about the type of the public service that we wanted, which is non-partisan. And we started to emphasize the imperative of professionalization as early as that time. And subsequently, Mandela put together a presidential review committee to really advise government on how to go about putting together a professionalized public service. Vincent Mapai was the chairperson of the committee. He finalized his report towards the end of 1997, but I think it was formally submitted in 1998. However, in 1997, the governing party was in Mahikeng for their Congress. And they actually said that it is too early to implement Dr. Vincent Mapai's recommendation, particularly around the question of meritocracy as a symbol, as a principle for staffing practices in the public service. Because by then, I think the country was still going through transitional processes, and therefore they wanted to put people that they could actually trust in terms of providing leadership on the transformation of the public service. Towards the end of 2007 or towards the end of 2006, 2007, government had already started to say that now I think we are at a point where we think that we are ready to implement a presidential review committee's recommendation on the question of meritocracy. Another conference happened, but unfortunately, that conference came with the outcome, which basically said that we are not really going to move away from political appointment in the administration of the state. In fact, from 2007, it became even worse, and that created a whole range of problems, despite the fact that we had so many policy imperatives that they've been calling for the professionalization of the public service. It is quite interesting that also if you analyze a myriad of directives, rule and regulation within the Department of Public Service and Administration, you have got excellent instruments that have been developed, ready for implementation to professionalize the public service. So the issue that was raised by one of the audience members, that you need to have the heart, you need to have the commitment as an individual to say that I want this happen. I think it's critically important. So all what I'm trying to say, Prof, in a nutshell, to answer your question, why did it take us so long? Politics disturb our progress in terms of professionalizing the public service. And I like the question that Temba asked earlier. How do we take it away, professionalization and a project away from politics? And the fact that we want it to be embedded in strategic stakeholders that are key for the development of the country, your university, your professional bodies, the civil society, all these, I think, are critically important to ensure that ultimately we get this professionalization exercise through and get implemented. Our approach in the panel, Chairperson, was that even if 50% of our recommendation get implemented, we will be happy, because it will be an indication that as a country, we are actually getting somewhere. So those were some of the few things that I wanted to highlight, but also more importantly, the whole concept of the professionalization of the public service, it it actually generated wide interest within society. And that interest for us is very important because that interest will actually serve as a mechanism to demand accountability if certain things as recommended in the framework are not actually being followed through. So society, civil society is there, and society in general to say that, but this is what we have. We want to see action related to that. You know, again, the question of politics chairperson, if you remember, just quickly as I finalize, the Zondo Commission was very clear. Political interference in the bureaucracy for self-saving ends is unconstitutional. At some point, some years back, I was in a panel discussion with Professor Shatragutu, who is a constitutional expert. He used to be at University of South Africa, but I think now he has retired. He also put it very clear that political appointment practices in the bureaucracy are unconstitutional. The case which was actually decided by our courts is that of William Lokoti and Amatolo District Municipality. Judge Pikari was very clear in terms of saying that this staffing practice, political staffing practice in the bureaucracy is actually against the law. So we do have a case law that says that political appointment in terms of staffing the bureaucracy in the country is unconstitutional. So that one is very clear. The law is there, the case law is there, the constitution is there. So I just wanted to also say that before I actually conclude, but I'm handing over to my colleagues. Thanks, Chairperson.
Thanks, and a very quick, so we only got time for a very quick comment from you, Mbongiseni.
Sorry, Stephanie.
I took your time. I'm sorry.
No, not a problem. Actually, I think I'll be very quick. So I think to me, what is clear is that this kind of reform does not happen without a fight. So I think we need to be clear, and we need to not kid ourselves that this is going to be a straightforward process. In countries where this has happened, there have been countries like Singapore where the political leadership says this is what we want to do, and they drive those reforms. In countries like ours, where politics is what has been, Professor Maserumule and other other people who commented have talked about. I think what it's going to take is a fight from society, a fight from civil society, and what it requires is for all of us, I think, who take an interest in this, to begin to work together, to collaborate, to begin to advocate together collectively for these things to be implemented, for the recommendations of this framework to be implemented. But I think we are also in a context in line with what Sarah said earlier. We're in a context where there are some green shoots and there are some openings that we need to seize. So the openings, I think, that we can work with, it goes to, somebody asked the question about the National School of Government, for example, and what role it could play. I think the National School of Government is kind of, in the last while, it's kind of kicked into a position where it really is trying to drive this work, and it requires our support. It requires our support when it comes under political pressure. And let's remind ourselves again here, talking about the Zondo Commission, as Prof just did. There was a time when, and part of what has set us back, is that there was deliberate hollowing out of capability in the state for nefarious reasons. And to begin to turn the corner on that, it took a fight. I think to take this work forward will take a fight, and we need to be involved, to be prepared to be involved in that fight. There aren't enough of us, I think, who pay attention, for example, to reforms in the public service, to the laws that Professor Maserumule and the framework talk about, that are actually currently before Parliament, or in some instances, bills that haven't yet entered Parliament. There just aren't enough of us who are paying attention to that, because public service reform is something that seems very unsexy to a lot of people. It's the political stuff that's hot, that captures the headlines. So I think more of us need to pay attention to these kinds of things and get involved in advocating and be prepared to be involved in the fights. But to end off, I want to also point out that there are people within different parts of the state who are trying to drive this. Some of them are meeting either very serious headwinds because people who were involved in the hollowing out of the state are still, in some instances, embedded in those institutions. And that's where really our fight needs to go. Thank you, Stephanie. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mbongiseni. I think what's clear is that it's a really complex set of issues, but also a set of issues that is absolutely essential. And like you can see in the chats and in the comments that people are really keen to participate in solving this problem. We're going to close now, but I'm just wondering if someone from the PSETA would like to come in with a last word. I know there was a question and there has been a bit of discussion on the role of the National School of Government and the PSETA, but I was just wondering if someone from the PSETA would like to come in and give us a last word before we close. Shivantini or someone else from the PSETA, or shall we just thank everyone and close? I'm not sure if the PSETA has a comment or a response to what has been tabled here today. I think it's been a lot of very thought-provoking and important issues. Yeah, Shivantini, why don't you come in? And then we'll close on that note.
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, and yes, I'll try and be as brief as possible. I think there's been a lot that's been said, and a lot of these comments are parts of what we have had to reflect on as PSETA, including the aspect of what does transversal mean, where do we focus our efforts on, what is the role of the PSETA, what is the role of the NSG, and how do we collaborate and work more closely together. I do think that unpacking this professionalization framework towards implementation is part of our focus as PSETA, working very closely with the DPSA and the NSG, and that you could see our work as PSETA moving more towards that in terms of our focus for the upcoming period. And again, we believe it's an ongoing conversation. We are very, very aware of the political aspect and how this impacts our interventions, and that also that skills is not the only solution to the issues we're facing across, but truly do believe that there are sufficient institutions within the public sector that already exist with relevant mandates. And if we can all play our role as we are supposed to, this notion of a professional public service will be reached. And let me leave it there, Steph. Thank you very much to yourself as well as to the speakers for the engagements today.
Thank you. And it's spot on 12 o'clock. So I know that it's been a long session, but a very thought-provoking one. And I'm going to end it there. Thank you very, very much to the two speakers who really put a lot on the table today. Thanks to all who asked questions and comments, and thanks to all for participating. Cheers, everyone. I'm going to end it there.